Okay, let's unpack this.
Right. We've got a fascinating, and I have to say, really broad stack of sources today. Our listener sent in material covering, well, everything from ancient Greece and Athenian democracy right through to Roman law. Deep stuff.
It really is. And it seems the core interest might have started with Roman manumission, freeing slaves, giving them legal status. But these sources, they kind of force us to zoom out first, don't they?
They absolutely do. Before we can even get to the specifics of a Roman freed person, we have to grapple with how these two massive ancient powers, Athens and Rome, structured power itself, how they thought about status, about justice.
Exactly. So our mission really is a study in contrast. We're synthesizing these threads. We need to look at Athens with its very fluid, almost rhetorical legal culture based on mass juries and pit that against Rome's structured, formal, professionalized approach to law.
We're digging for those surprising nuggets, the foundations of their power, how they maintain social order in such different ways.
It's a huge deep dive. So the plan is start with the basics, the ground level Greek geography and economy. That shapes so much.
Definitely.
Then we'll dive into Athenian justice, the whole world of stasis, civil strife, and that unique concept, hubris.
And after Athens?
We cross the Med to Rome. We'll look at their jurists, their sort of conservative innovation in law, and finally, how they meticulously defined status, property, and punishment. That's where we'll see how things like manumission fit in.
Sounds like a plan. Let's get grounded in Greece first.
Okay, so Greece. To understand why it ended up as all these separate city-states, the polis, you just have to look at a map, right?
It's fundamental. The sources are really clear on this. Greece is mountains and small valleys. That's the defining feature.
So the land itself basically encouraged separation.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It naturally fostered these independent communities. The geography was actively working against any kind of national unity for the Hellenes. It made large-scale land empires really difficult to establish and hold.
But ironically, the thing that divided them on land, the mountains, was complemented by something that connected them, the sea.
Yes, exactly. That broken coastline, all those islands scattered everywhere. It made sea travel almost inevitable and efficient.
So sea empires were easier.
The sources suggest just that. Look at Athens later on. Building a maritime empire was more feasible than trying to conquer and control the rugged landmass. The sea was the highway network. The mountains were the walls.
And it wasn't just the terrain. The sources also mention the climate, described as having a, quote, bracing quality. What impact did that have?
Well, ancient writers felt it promoted, vigor and energy. It wasn't a lazy climate, apparently. It had a certain severity.
Demanded hard work.
It demanded hard work. And it also fostered a, let's say, robust culture. But that hard work was also just plain necessary for survival, because the land itself wasn't particularly rich, especially around Athens and Attica.
Right, the soil wasn't great for wheat, better for barley, so farming wasn't easy pickings.
Not at all. It required constant effort, grueling work, often. And this agricultural struggle had massive knock-on effects, economically and politically.
How so?
Well, think about it. Population grows, right? But the land can only support so many people. What do?
You look elsewhere.
Exactly. It fuels maritime enterprise. The Greeks had to trade, they had to found colonies overseas just to supplement their livelihoods. It wasn't just wanderlust, it was often economic desperation driving the more adventurous or maybe just the hungrier people to find richer lands.
This constant struggle for resources must have made their economy quite fragile, even when Athens became powerful.
Oh, definitely. And the sources link Athens' big trade boom directly to things happening elsewhere in the Greek world. It wasn't just Athenian genius in isolation.
What was the connection?
Well, the timing is key. Athenian trade really took off just as older trading powers were declining. Think about the Ionian cities on the coast of modern Turkey and the Phoenicians. Their power was weakened, especially after the Greeks managed to beat back the Persian invasion.
So Athens filled a vacuum.
Pretty much. They stepped right into that commercial gap. And you can see the evidence in things like the tribute records from the Athenian Empire, the Delian League.
Where the money was flowing.
Exactly. The sources mention Lampsacus, a city on the Hellespont near the Black Sea entrance. It ended up paying twice as much tribute as Ephesus.
Ephesus, one of the richest, most famous Ionian cities.
Right. So that tells you trade patterns were shifting, moving towards the North and West Aegean, with Athens sitting right in the middle, benefiting hugely.
And all this new wealth, this trade focus, it must have completely changed Athenian society itself. The population numbers are pretty striking.
They really are. At its peak, Attica might have had around 250,000 people. That's maybe double the size of a big rival city like Corinth. And the key thing, the defining feature of that population,
Slavery.
yeah, almost half the population were slaves. Nearly 1 in 2 people.
That's staggering. It means daily life for the average citizen, the city's whole power structure, fundamentally rested on enslaved labor. Where were most of these slaves working?
The sources make an interesting distinction here. It wasn't uniform. The big driver for slave imports was the growth of manufacturing and industry in the towns, workshops, mines, things like that.
So industrial centers needed lots of slaves.
Huge influxes of slave hands, as the source puts it. But if you were in a town that still mostly relied on agriculture, the demand for slaves is actually pretty small. It was urban industry that fueled the massive scale of slavery in Athens.
And all this trade, all this silver flowing in,
Yeah.
it created wealth, sure, but it also sounds like it created massive economic pressure, inflation, high costs.
Absolutely. Money replaced barter, silver became common, and prices shot up. Basic stuff like barley and wheat were 2 or 3 times more expensive than they'd been just a century earlier. But the real shocker is livestock prices.
Ah, yes, the famous sheep example. Tell us about the sheep.
It's a great indicator. Back in the time of Solon, the great reformer, maybe early 6th century BC, a sheep cost about 1 drachma. Fast forward to the age of Pericles, Athens' golden age, mid-5th century. That same sheep. Nearly 50 drachmae.
50. That's a 50-fold increase. That's not just inflation. That sounds like hyperinflation, or at least massive wealth concentration pushing up asset prices.
It points to both, I think. Rapid inflation making essentials expensive, and probably a concentration of wealth from trade, allowing the rich to bid up the price of assets like livestock.
So the cost of living is rocketing, capital goods are expensive. This must have made it incredibly tough for smaller players, right? Starting a business, getting a loan.
Very tough. Capital was scarce relative to the demand, and maybe security for loans wasn't always great. The sources state a typical interest rate for a mercantile loan was a painful 12%.
12%. That's incredibly high by modern standards for a commercial loan. It really paints a picture of a high-risk, high-reward environment, but also one where debt could easily spiral, especially for the less wealthy.
And that kind of economic pressure, that high cost of capital, that's exactly the sort of thing that fuels social unrest, demands for political reform. It ties everything back. Athenian democracy didn't happen in a vacuum. It grew out of that difficult soil, those risky trade routes, those economic pressures.
Okay, so that intense economic backdrop, the struggle for resources, the high stakes,
Yeah.
it leads us perfectly into Athenian justice, which was, well, just as intense and high stakes, but in a totally different way than Rome. We're shifting from economic pressure to social and legal pressure in the courts.
And the absolute nightmare scenario for any Athenian political thinker was stasis, civil strife, factional violence tearing the city apart. Doesn't matter who you read, Thucydides, Plato, Aristotle, they all fundamentally agreed on one thing.
What was that?
The rule of law was the only thing stopping society from descending into chaos. It was the bulwark against stasis.
But they didn't all agree on what rule of law actually meant in practice, did they? Especially in democratic Athens.
Not at all. That was the big debate. You had critics of democracy, maybe more aristocratic thinkers, who looked at the huge citizen juries, the emotional speeches, the sometimes unpredictable verdicts, and basically said, this isn't law, it's lawlessness, it's mob rule. They contrasted it with some idealized, perhaps mythical, stable version of the rule of law.
And the Democrats pushed back.
They pushed back hard. Democratic politicians argued that no, law as practiced in the democracy was precisely what protected the system. It was the shield against tyranny or an aristocratic coup. The law was the democracy in a way.
And the way they did justice was radically different from a modern courtroom.
Very.
Amateur.
That's a good way to put it. The whole system depended almost entirely on private citizens deciding to bring a lawsuit. There wasn't really a public prosecutor system for most things. And crucially, neither the judges nor the people arguing the case had any formal legal training.
No law schools, no bar exams.
None of that. The judges were just thousands of ordinary citizens chosen by lot. So the whole system relied on what you might call civic competence, maybe common sense, rather than professional legal expertise.
So if you don't have trained lawyers and judges arguing about the precise meaning of statutes, what does a trial actually focus on?
It couldn't really focus on complex statutory interpretation. The system wasn't built for it. Instead, trials became contests about character, reputation, and probability. Can you convince this huge jury of your peers that you're just not the kind of person who would do this terrible thing?
And that your opponent is exactly the kind of scoundrel who would lie about it.
Precisely. It was a deeply personal and social evaluation. The sources show orators openly playing on core social values and tensions. Rivalry between families, old grudges, questions of honor, provoking envy, appealing to a desire for revenge even.
It sounds like a soap opera sometimes.
It could be incredibly dramatic. The rhetorical tactics were direct. You didn't just refute the charge, you attacked your opponent's entire life history, his family's reputation, his personal habits, anything to undermine his credibility.
And the defendant would appeal directly to their own standing in the community.
Absolutely. There's that great quote from a speech by Demosthenes where the defendant essentially turns to the huge jury and asks, "Does any one of you know me to be capable of this?" He's not asking them to interpret a law. He's asking for a character reference from the entire community right there in court.
So the jury wasn't just deciding guilt or innocence based on the specific charge. They were doing something more.
Much more. The sources talk about the demos, the people acting as the jury, exercising a kind of censorial power. They weren't just applying law, they were actively defining and enforcing the community's collective judgments about right and wrong behavior. What does it mean to be a good Athenian citizen?
And they could bring in charges or considerations that weren't even technically part of the law they were supposed to be ruling on.
Yes, that's a key point. The example given is in impiety trials, charges related to disrespecting the gods or religious customs. Litigants felt perfectly comfortable adding a charge like corrupting the young to the case, even if the actual law about impiety said nothing about corrupting the young.
Because the jury cared about that kind of moral behavior, regardless of the specific statute.
Exactly. They were shaping the application of the law to fit their broader moral expectations. And no single concept captures this blending of law, morality, and social status better than the Athenian idea of hubris.
We use the word hubris today to mean arrogance, basically. But it was much more serious in Athens, wasn't it?
Oh, much more. Legally, hubris was a serious offense. It meant outrage, insolence, the violation of someone's honor and status. It could certainly involve physical assault, but it went way beyond just hitting someone. There were specific laws against violence, especially during sacred times like religious festivals.
That case involving Medius seems relevant here.
It's a perfect example. Demosthenes accused Medius of committing acts of hubris during a festival, a time when the city was supposed to be observing a sacred truce, a time when even property disputes were legally postponed. To commit violence or outrage then wasn't just an attack on an individual. It was seen as an attack on the gods and the entire social order of the city. The potential penalty was severe, even death.
And importantly, hubris wasn't always about physical harm. It often targeted the family's reputation, especially its sexual honor.
Yes, this is crucial for understanding Athenian social values. Hubris could certainly mean the rape or mistreatment of girls, obviously a violation. But look at the other examples the sources give. They're very revealing.
Like the brother's mistress showing up in public covered in jewels. Why is that hubris?
Because it's a public spectacle that shames the legitimate family. Think about it. The women of the household, the wife, the daughters were expected to be modest, to uphold the family's eidos, its sense of shame and respectability. Their virtue was the family's honor in many ways.
So when the mistress flaunts wealth derived from the brother,
it publicly implies that the brother is disrespecting his own household, spending family resources improperly, and it tarnishes the reputation of the legitimate women of the family. They are the specific victims, the source says, because their honor, their social standing, is publicly compromised by this display.
Wow. Okay. And the same principle applied within marriage.
Yes, the example of Alcibiades bringing other women into his own house was cited as hubris against his wife. It was a profound public dishonoring of her and, by extension, her family and his own household. So in Athens, you see, justice wasn't this cold, objective process. It was deeply personal, fiercely contested, and always, always about maintaining social honor and standing within that very public, very demanding citizen body.
Right. That picture of Athenian justice, emotional, rhetorical, judged by thousands of amateurs based on character, it just couldn't be more different from what we find when we turn to Rome.
It's like entering a different universe, legally speaking. If Athenian law was shaped by the roar of the crowd in the assembly and the courtroom, Roman law was shaped really by the quiet work of the jurists.
The jurists. These seem like the key figures in Rome. Who were they exactly? not lawyers in our sense.
No, not professional advocates arguing cases for a fee, generally. They were primarily statesmen, usually from the top aristocratic families, the patricians, although over time that circle widened a bit. Their role was to interpret the law, to give legal opinions to magistrates who were presiding over cases or to private citizens who asked for advice.
And they did this for free, as a public service.
Largely, yes. It was considered part of their duty as leading citizens, part of their contribution to the state. So they occupied this interesting space, very practical, dealing with real legal problems, but also highly intellectual, almost academic. They wrote extensive commentaries on the law.
And these writings, these opinions, they actually became the main source of law, more so than statutes passed by assemblies.
That's one of the most striking things the sources highlight. If you look at something like the Digest of Justinian, which compiled centuries of Roman legal thought, actual lex laws passed by the assemblies or the emperor makes up a surprisingly small portion of it.
So what's the rest?
It's mostly the recorded opinions, the debates, the disagreements, and the case solutions developed by generations of jurists. It's essentially a massive body of jurisprudence built up incrementally over centuries through interpretation and application. That's why people often compare it to the way English common law developed, growing organically from case decisions and expert commentary.
Okay, so if the jurists are interpreting and essentially making law through their opinions, that leads us to this really counterintuitive Roman tool, the legal fiction. We think of fiction as false, but they used it conservatively.
It sounds paradoxical, doesn't it? But yes, that's the key insight. Unlike modern law, which tends to shy away from blatant fictions, Roman jurists embraced them. And they saw it as a way to preserve continuity and respect for the older laws.
How does pretending something is true preserve the old law?
Well, imagine you have an ancient law, maybe from the 12 Tables, that's deeply respected but totally impractical for the current situation in Rome centuries later. Instead of formally repealing or amending that revered old law, which might be politically difficult or seem disrespectful, the jurists could use a fiction.
To get around it while pretending not to.
Sort of. It allowed them to extend the scope of an old rule or subtly change its effect without actually abolishing the original text. The fiction acted like a bridge, allowing the old law to remain formally intact and respected, even while its practical application was being significantly altered to meet new needs. It maintained the appearance of continuity.
So it was a way to adapt the law, maybe, for dealing with the increasing number of non-citizens, foreigners living in Rome, without having to publicly admit the old rules were broken.
That's a perfect example. The classic case is the fictio civitatis, the fiction of citizenship.
Tell me about that.
Okay, so a fundamental principle of Roman civil law, pluralis civil, was that it was only for Roman citizens. But what happens when a foreigner, peregrinus, has a dispute that really needs to be handled under the civil law rules? Technically, they're excluded.
So the fiction pretends they're a citizen.
For the purpose of that specific lawsuit, yes. The magistrate, advised by the jurist, might instruct the judge to proceed as if the foreigner were a citizen. This allowed the case to be resolved using the appropriate civil law framework, providing necessary legal protection. But crucially, it did so while still paying formal respect to the old principle that the habeas civil was for citizens only. The underlying rule wasn't abolished, it was just creatively navigated.
That's incredibly clever. Maintaining the form while changing the substance, it protected the system's legitimacy.
Exactly. It allowed Roman law to be incredibly adaptable and grow to govern a vast, complex empire, while always maintaining this deep, almost religious respect for its ancient foundations. It was conservative innovation at its finest.
And this Roman obsession with structure, with defined roles and limits, you even see it in their emergency measures, like the office of dictator.
The dictator, or magister populi, master of the people, was the ultimate emergency power. But even this office shows the Roman tendency towards strict definition. How was he chosen?
Not elected, right?
No popular vote, no assembly influence at all. He was chosen solely by one of the consuls, pure executive appointment. And his power during his term was absolute. The sources stress there was no appeal from his decisions.
But it was strictly temporary.
Critical so, maximum of 6 months, and his term automatically ended if the consul who appointed him left office. So, immense power, but sharply limited in time. And then there's that wonderfully weird detail.
He couldn't ride a horse.
Constitutionally prohibited from mounting on horseback. The supreme commander, the man potentially leading the legions, had to walk or use a carriage.
Why on earth
The sources don't give a definitive why, but perhaps it was symbolic, maybe linking him to the infantry, the citizen soldiers, rather than the aristocratic cavalry. Or maybe just a traditional check, a reminder that even absolute power had customary limits. Whatever the reason, it perfectly illustrates the Roman mindset. Even necessary autocratic power must be bound by specific, traditional rules.
Okay, so fast-forwarding from the Republic to the Empire, that power becomes permanent in the emperor, but the day-to-day administration of justice gets delegated, right, to powerful officials like the prefects.
Yes, as the empire grew and Rome became this massive metropolis, the old republican system wasn't sufficient. Judicial authority became increasingly centralized under the emperor, and he delegated significant chunks of it to key officials. The urban prefect and the praetorian prefect are the big ones.
The urban prefect handled things in the city.
Primarily, his judicial role really starts to take off under Nero, initially focused on specific complex crimes like forged wills under a particular law, the Lex Cornelia Testamentaria, but his power ballooned over time.
How far did it extend eventually?
By the Severan period, say early 3rd century AD, the urban prefect had jurisdiction over basically all crimes committed within Rome or even up to 100 miles around the city. He could impose serious sentences like deportation to an island, relegatio or deportatio.
Could he impose the death penalty?
The sources suggest his capital jurisdiction was sometimes limited or contested. There's an example under Domitian where a prefect apparently declined to handle a capital case. But generally, yes, he became a very powerful judge.
And the praetorian prefect, commander of the guard, but also a judge.
Yes, another example of military and judicial functions merging under the empire. His judicial powers were put on a firm legal basis, again around the Severan period, probably by a lex fabia. His jurisdiction ran largely in parallel with the urban prefects.
So two major judicial figures, both getting their power directly from the emperor.
Exactly. It shows how Rome adapted to the scale of empire. They didn't necessarily abolish old structures, but they layered on new, powerful, specialized offices to handle the sheer volume and complexity of legal administration, all ultimately flowing from the emperor's authority. Very Roman, structured, hierarchical, and adaptive through addition rather than revolution.
Okay, so this incredibly structured hierarchical legal system naturally leads us to the final part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
How Roman law defined status, dealt with property, and imposed punishment. And this is where we can circle back a bit to our listeners' original interest in status changes, like manumission.
Right. Because status was everything in Rome, and the law reflected and enforced that reality constantly. Well, let's start with gender. The sources are blunt. Papinian, a famous jurist, stated clearly that in many parts of our law, the condition of women was below that of men.
Legally subordinate, but does that mean they had no rights?
Not necessarily. It's complex. While their formal legal status was lower, they often needed guardians for certain transactions. For instance, Roman women in the classical period, especially from the upper classes, could actually have significant economic independence. They could own property, inherit, and importantly, they often had much more freedom to initiate divorce than women in, say, later Christian Europe or even 19th century America.
So a legal inferiority didn't always translate into total practical powerlessness.
Exactly. It's a nuance we have to grasp. But the hierarchy was definitely there, and it extended beyond gender to social rank. This was explicitly codified.
The anastiores and the humiliores.
Yes, the more honorable and the more lowly. Men of authority, wealth, status versus the common folk, and the law treated them differently. The source gives a great example. An insult.
An insult wasn't just an insult.
No. The severity of the offense, legally speaking, depended on who insulted whom. If a person of low degree insulted a senator or any magistrate, the insult was legally considered aggravated. The same words carried more weight and likely a heavier penalty, simply because of the status difference. Justice wasn't blind to rank.
That status consciousness even affected rules of evidence, didn't it? Specifically around torture.
Yes, Roman law generally had rules restricting the torture of free citizens, but there were critical exceptions, and they tell you what the state feared most. Torture of slaves was permitted in adultery investigations, but only, the source notes, if the truth couldn't be discovered otherwise. A sort of last resort.
Like, what about free people? Could they be tortured?
Only in the most serious cases threatening the state itself. Treason and conspiracy. That's where the normal protections for citizens broke down. It shows how seriously they took political stability and, interestingly, sexual morality within the elite, as adultery investigations allowed slave torture.
And the punishment for adultery, if convicted, wasn't just a fine or jail. It was about destroying status.
absolutely brutal in its social consequences. A convicted woman lost half her dowry, a huge financial hit, and a third of her other property. Her lover lost a third of his property. Bad enough. But then came the relegation.
Exile.
Yes, both were exiled, typically to different remote islands. And the final nail in the coffin for the woman's social existence. She was legally barred from ever inheriting property or marrying another freeborn Roman. The law explicitly classified her with actresses and prostitutes, women considered outside the bounds of respectable society, a complete and permanent social death sentence.
Okay, now let's get to the heart of status transition. Slavery and freedom. Roman slavery is often called porous because manumission was relatively common, creating this unique class of freedpersons, liberti. How did the law handle their ongoing relationship with their former masters, now patrons?
This is where the Roman obsession with legal detail shines. The sources we have give some fascinating insights into the post-manumission reality. A freed person, libertus or liberta, owed duties of respect and sometimes services, opere, to their patron. But what about property? Did the patrons still have a claim on their former slave's success?
You'd assume so, maybe.
Well, the law, at least according to imperial constitutions cited in our sources, was quite specific and perhaps surprisingly limited. A patron, or their children, could only claim rights over the freed person's property during the freed person's lifetime under specific conditions.
Well, they were.
They had to prove to a court that they, the patron or their children, were genuinely ill or poor and actually needed financial support, like monthly provisions, from the freedman.
So it wasn't an automatic right to skim off the freedman's profits. It was more like a safety net for the patron if they fell on hard times.
That seems to be the implication of this particular source. It suggests a significant degree of economic autonomy for the freed person, provided they fulfilled basic duties of respect and didn't see their patron fall into poverty. The state seems to be balancing the patron's traditional rights with the freed person's newfound status.
But Rome being Rome, there were different kinds of freed persons, weren't there? And that affected the patron's rights, especially regarding inheritance.
Exactly. Not everyone freed became a full Roman citizen immediately. There was a very important intermediate category called Junian Latins.
Who were they?
These were people freed through less formal methods, maybe not meeting all the requirements of the Lex Eliacentia or, as mentioned here, the Lex Junia. They were free, they weren't slaves anymore, but they didn't get full citizenship. They had Latin rights, a kind of second-class status.
And how did this affect the patron's economic interest?
Dramatically, especially upon the Junian Latins' death. The sources state their estates reverted entirely to their manumitters, the patrons. The law treated it as if the property was still peculium.
Peculium being that fund or property a master allowed a slave to manage, but which legally still belonged to the master.
Precisely. So for a Junian Latin, upon death, the patron effectively reclaimed the property as if the manumission hadn't fully severed that economic link. This contrasts sharply with a freedman who was a full citizen, where the patron's inheritance rights were much more restricted.
So the Junian Latin status was a clever legal construction. It gave freedom, maybe encouraging loyalty and work, but ensured the patron ultimately kept the capital accumulated.
It looks very much like that. It protected the patron's long-term economic benefit while still offering the powerful incentive of personal freedom. A very Roman solution layered status, careful economic calculations.
And even while enslaved, Roman law recognized the slave's capacity to act economically for the master.
Right. Yes, a slave could enter into contracts, stipulate, creating obligations that benefited the master. The slave was an instrument of acquisition, and the law even worked out complex scenarios.
Like a slave owned by two masters.
Yeah. Right. If a slave owned jointly by two masters made a stipulation, maybe received a promise of payment, but only one of the masters legally had the capacity to acquire that type of obligation, perhaps due to their own status or legal standing,
the obligation went entirely to the master who could legally receive it.
Correct. The law didn't split it or nullify it. It assigned it wholly to the capable master. It shows, again, the incredible, if rather chilling, legal sophistication applied to managing property rights, even when that property was a human being acting as an economic agent.
Wow. We have really covered an immense amount of ground today. We started on the rocky hillsides of Greece.
And ended up in the intricate corridors of Roman law courts and imperial administration.
The contrast is just undeniable, isn't it? Athens, controlling conflict through public opinion, through rhetoric, through these mass juries making gut decisions about character, honor, hubris. Very dynamic, very volatile.
Fiercely public, yes. And then Rome. building this incredibly detailed, structured system of written law, interpreted by experts, administered by specialized officials, professionalized, formalized, built for endurance.
But underneath those huge differences in method, the sources show both systems were utterly reliant on hierarchy, on status.
Absolutely critical in both. Athenian justice revolved around protecting the honor of the citizen family, reacting violently to perceived hubris. Roman law explicitly divided society into the privileged and the less privileged, the honestures and humiliores, and tailored justice accordingly.
And that complex Roman status system, with categories like Junian Latins, shows just how meticulously they managed social mobility and economic interests, especially around slavery and freedom.
It really does. The path from slave to citizen was real in Rome, unlike many other slave societies, but it was carefully regulated every step of the way by legal status.
And perhaps the most fascinating takeaway for me comes back to those Roman jurists and their legal fictions, that idea of conservative innovation.
It's so powerful, this idea that major legal change, real adaptation, wasn't driven by radical reformers shouting for revolution, but by these careful, conservative figures using technicalities, using fictions.
Like pretending a foreigner was a citizen for a lawsuit.
Precisely, to allow the system to evolve while maintaining this deep deference to the ancient laws they were effectively superseding. They moved forward by constantly paying respect to the past.
Which leaves us, and leaves you, the listener, with a pretty provocative thought, doesn't it? When you look around today at our own institutions, our courts, governments, even corporations, how often is significant change, maybe a fundamental shift in power or status or how justice works, actually being achieved not through loud pronouncements of novelty, but through these quiet, seemingly technical adjustments? How often is progress masked as tradition, using the language of continuity to enact deep change?
That Roman impulse to innovate while appearing conservative might be more alive and well than we think, something to definitely mull over.